We're back. Corey Hughes, Bloody History. We are going to continue from where we left off, this deposition of Ann Goodpasture. So you can tell that the powers that be in regards to the ARRB, they kind of knew she was full of shit from the jump, right? So, because this is really her fourth deposition. If I'm not mistaken, she did one in 76, one in 78, just like David Atlee Phillips. And then she did one in 95. And when we get done with this, we'll jump to her 1998 deposition. So they knew she was full of shit because they kept calling her back to ask her the same questions over again, right? So at some point, we should jump to George Joannides and his deception in regards to his working with the ARRB. Or was it the HSCA? Either one. He shouldn't have been anywhere near any of these investigations because he was in Dealey Plaza, first off, and second off, he was working for JM Wave in 63. So, but we'll get to all that. All right, so let us continue. My next question goes back to something that I asked before. Have you heard of a cable being sent, we'll say, between Mexico City and headquarters that does not have a sequential cable number on it? Well, I guess that would be back channel, but I don't know the details of it. Okay, and then they take a break. They come back. Ms. Goodpasture, I would like to talk to you about the organization of the Mexico City station. We've talked about some of the people, and we've talked about the CIA organization, but now if we can just talk about some things related to the station itself. Could you tell me how the filing system in the station was organized, as best you understand? The filing system consisted of a large assortment. There were files that were turned over to the station by the FBI when the station opened. There was a system of records that headquarters had established for all field stations, including the Mexico station. When the station opened, and then later there was a revised system, we had index cards for the old files. We had index cards for the new system. We had personality files. We had subject files. We had travel manifests. We had chronological files. I guess that's it. There was a chief of the file room. I don't remember who that was in 63. There was, they changed every 2 years. They had 2-year tours. There were not supposed to be any individual files for case officers. For instance, all of our records were supposed to be kept in the main file room. We had boxes and out boxes of stuff that we had pending always. Now, those reports that you have, those operational reports, you see my name on a lot of correspondence that was going through. Those reports had to be written to justify getting money to continue the projects. Anything that came from one of those projects that went out to Washington, Mr. Scott would read it to me to make sure that I took off the number it got in accounting, because if you didn't have any numbers, you didn't get any money. That's the one of the reasons that so much of the material was routed to me. Some people kept copies of things squirreled away so they could find them in their boxes and in their safes. All the safes were located in one central room, and that room had security control alarms. That room was adjacent to the communications room. It was also adjacent, or in a park, a secured area encompassed the file room, communications room, and the photographic lab. At night, everybody had to take all their papers, and they had safes, and they went back and they stayed there. The next day, you hauled them all out, and periodically we would clean our inboxes and out, and things would end up in the central files. Does that answer your question? Yes, for the personality files, or P files, that would be the standards that would be used for determining when to open a P file. That was something. I believe it took that. There may have been a category from Washington and instruction of when to open one. I don't know. But we had a 201 file, and in those cases, if a communication came down to Washington and it already had a file on it, like if you got a bunch of material on a personality and he had a file, then he would be given another file immediately, probably the same one that was on the Washington one. The time to open one was probably left up to the individual case officer. I'm just guessing. Now, the category I would have used if I had only one piece of paper, I would have probably made an index card on it. If the name turned up again with any amount of material, or we started an investigation involving that name, I would have opened the individual file, but I wouldn't have opened a file for only one piece of paper when I had an index card on it. Okay? I can't answer the question about what the instruction was. You'll have to get that from the person in charge of the file room. What kinds of things would be included and excluded from the chronological file? For example, would all cables be in the chronological file? I think there was a chrono. I think all the cables, chrono of all dispatches, a chrono of all intelligence reports, and a chrono of all our transcripts, a chrono of the projects. I kept a chronological file of almost everything that we worked on that happened every day, because in many instances, that's the only way we could locate things. Do you know what happened to those files that you and other people created during 1963? I don't know. When I left Mexico, the file room was bigger than the rest of the station. When Mr. Scott retired, he was replaced by someone that had, I felt they could do with less file work, but that may have been a headquarters instruction based on the situation that developed in other countries when them bases were overrun and their files were compromised. But they did eliminate a lot of the records at that time, but I don't know what the criteria was. Okay. And the person that was there at that time would have been chief of station, would have been redacted. I believe his deputy was redacted. So if they're talking about in 1963, that would have been Win Scott, which fits the redaction. I believe his deputy was Alan B. White, or redacted may have been gone. I don't know, but there should have been a list and inventory, I think, of the records that were destroyed. Maybe because they thought there were duplicates in Washington of all of them. But when I went back to Washington in 1977, we retrieved chronological files, so not all of them were destroyed. I don't think that the team that went down to consolidate the files would have destroyed anything that they thought was of any value. If the FBI had wanted to get some information out of the files, they would have been able to have direct access to that, or did they need to go through you? They would have written what they usually did. They bring a list down of names and ask for file traces. They were not permitted to go into the file room and use the files, and we weren't permitted to go into their file room. They were not permitted to go through our offices. Our office was a restricted area except for the front part, which was the reception area, and I think other visitors would go into the area where Dave Phillips was, and to Mr. Scott's office, and to the deputy chief of station's office. But the rest of us, we either met them in the conference room or we met them in a reception area. They gave us a slip of paper of 15 names on it, and someone in the station would trace those names and write an individual response to each one, which was a summary of whatever we had in each file. Who within the station had a very good idea about the scope of operations that were being conducted in Mexico City? A scope of operation. Scope of operations. I assume, for example, that Mr. Scott knew about all of the operations in Mexico City. I think Win Scott and the deputy chief of station would have been the only two people who knew all the operations of the station. My next question is going to be whether the deputy chief knew, and as far as you understand, did he? As far as I know, he knew about all the operations. Okay, did you ever have any... Well, he might not have had, it depended upon Win Scott, how thoroughly Win Scott briefed him. But before he came to Mexico, I'm sure he was briefed on everything that was going on down there, because if something happened to the chief of station, the deputy chief had to take over. Did you ever have any understanding about Mr. Phillips and Mr. Scott being involved in operations that Mr. White did not know about? No. Would that, there may have been, but I didn't know about it. Would it be surprising to you if Mr. Scott and Mr. Phillips did operations that Mr. White were kept out of? Well, at the time, it would not have, but in hindsight, nothing would surprise me. Did you have a sense of whether there was a particular close friendship between Mr. Scott and Mr. Phillips? Well, yes, there was a close friendship, because when Mr. Scott was going to be away, he recommended that Dave Phillips be made his deputy. This was before Alan White arrived. There was a period in there when the deputy chief of station was not transferred to a new post, and his replacement was not ready, because his replacement was somewhere else, and it would gap is what the word I'm searching there is. And when Scott recommended that Dave Phillips be named the deputy chief of station headquarters came back and said no, he didn't have sufficient experience, or words to that effect, that the deputy chief of station would be redacted, Alan White. So during that period, White was named deputy chief of station, and that was not in 63, though that was before then. That was like 62. Was there anyone at Mexico City who had responsibility for liaison between Mexico City and JM Wave? Well, it would have been Dave Phillips, I'm sure. Or are you talking about during that time that Phillips was there? I got to comment that just the fact of bringing up JM Wave at all, to me, says a lot. They're very interested in JM Wave. They know JM Wave was involved in a lot of this stuff. And I'm telling you, those guys were in Dealey Plaza. So, yes, or before his assignment, I think he was a responsible officer for everything that connected the Cubans. And then Goodpasture says, I believe they used the term that they were going to have a Cuban task force and he was going to be chief of it. Could you describe what kind of person Win Scott was? No, not really. Why is that? I never felt that I knew him well. I could give you my impressions of him. Please, yes. He was scholarly. He was a Southern gentleman. I felt he fancied himself as an intellectual, and he was a workaholic. He came to work very early in the morning. He was always there at night when I left. He had lots of friends, and he liked to entertain. He was particular about his dress, and he always wore dark suits and white shirts. One of the first things that I remember about Win Scott shortly after I arrived, someone who was a woman, who was a reports officer, was standing just outside the door of the office where I was sitting, and Mr. Scott walked by and said to this lady, type this up. And she said, I'm not a typist. I'm a reports officer. That's not my job. And he said, I'm chief of station here. Your job is to mop the floor if I tell you to. I don't know anyone that would say that now, but I caught on real quick that when he told me to do something, even if it was someone else's area, if he wanted me to type something, I would type it, and then I would take it to the person and say, Mr. Scott told me to write this. Now, he considered everybody there as being definitely under his supervision. He wrote constantly, pages and pages and pages. He read everything that other people wrote, and he had a pen. He corrected their grammar. He corrected their spelling. He put file numbers on things. He made notations of where things should be filed, how many copies should be made. You will note in, for instance, the copies of the transcript that you sent me. I don't know if you noticed along the side there was somebody's longhand. Now, those transcripts had the date on them and they had the time on them, but one of the things that was typical of Win was he put like 28th of September on the side in his handwriting, Spencerian style, 28 September, 10:32 hours, although that was already in the transcript. You know, another commentary here, you know, this era, this World War II era that produced these guys who were active in 63, who were in their 50s or early 60s in 63. They're all the same stoic type, right? Even if they live very different lifestyles. Like this guy just rings of a Clay Shaw type guy, right? A real man's man, tough guy, you know, very intellectual, paid attention to his dress. And it had to have been something of the era, because, I mean, look at Clay Shaw. Clay Shaw was a homosexual. He was a very butch homosexual, like you couldn't tell, right? And that was just something of the era that produced this cut of man, whether they were gay or not, right? And this is something the CIA seems to have picked up on. A lot of these guys they picked up who were produced by the war. And I say that produced by the war because it seems like they were hardened by the war. None of these guys got to escape the war. It's a different kind of man than the world produces today, that's for sure. All right, let me continue. Now, he considered everybody there as being definitely under his supervision. Oh, I already read that part. Let me see, where did I leave off? All right, so why did he do that? I don't know. Same thing was true if a dispatch had a file number on it and indication of where all the copies went. He might write on each page in big style, handwritten style, the same file number that was there typed. Did you ever have any sense of what his politics were like? Oh, he was very, very conservative. He was from Alabama. I think he was a supporter of George Wallace. He'd been in London. He had a photograph of Ronald Reagan when he visited London when Reagan was running for governor of California, I believe, or maybe it was something before that. I was still in Mexico at the time, and he brought that down, and he said, "Do you know who that is?" I said, "Of course. It's like Ronald Reagan, the movie star." He said he was in London when I was there. I hate for all this to be written. And there's another incident that I will tell you when this is no longer going. But I think that while Mr. Scott was very critical of any mistakes people made, when someone goofed, he was quick to tell us. One incident, I picked up a transcript. He wanted me to go get a transcript because he was going to show it to the ambassador, get a complete transcript, he said, or the reel. I had the transcript and he wanted the reel. So I called and I went out to pick up the reel. And I said, Mr. Scott wants to go over that with the ambassador. The person that brought it to me then mentioned to Redacted that Mr. Scott was interested in that because he wanted to call attention to the ambassador, and Redacted complained about it, and he said something to Wynn, and you told me this was never going to be given to anybody else. So Wynn called me in, and he said, you keep your mouth shut, and you tell Charlie to keep his mouth shut, and he was quick to let us know when we had goofed in his opinion. What were the politics like of David Atlee Phillips? Pardon me? What were David Phillips' politics like? His politics? Yes. I don't know. Dave Phillips was a very pleasant person. He was articulate. His job mainly had been, his career was mainly propaganda and slanting covert action type work and writing things with a slant. He had been with the newspaper, I think, in Latin America. I first met him in Guatemala. Not first, I didn't work with him, but I met him as part of the group. I don't think I ever heard him mention politics. The book The Night Watch, he portrays himself as being someone who did not like Richard Nixon and who voted for President Kennedy. Well, Dave Phillips, and then we got about 6 lines redacted here. And it says, but there again, I hate for things like this to be published because there are over 2,000 books already been written. The things they are looking for is something of this type that they can put in the other book to come out that will be just short of slander, and I feel that I shouldn't really comment on personalities for that reason. I don't want my former coworkers, or in Phillips' case, his family, to think that I'm trying to project him as a personality that was a show-off or something other than very sincere. Wonderful man that they feel that he is, and they have a right to feel that way about their father and their husband. So to answer your question, I can't comment on his politics because I don't know. Okay, so we have a little handwritten note here dated 6/10/98. Privacy issue of obvious concern to Goodpasture since this interview was not part of the sequestered collection but is actually an ARRB staff activity, presumably to aid in their understanding. And then I can't read the last little part of it. All right, so back to the interview. Do you know of any relationship that David Phillips had with James Angleton during the 63 period? No. Did you ever hear Mr. Phillips talk about Mr. Angleton? I don't think so. Would it be fair to say that in terms of surveillance of the Soviet embassy, Mr. Scott took principal responsibility for overseeing that surveillance? No, I don't think. I think when you say surveillance, what are you talking about? The telephone. Every operation against the Soviet embassy, particularly the telephone and telegraphs. The telephone, yes, very definitely. Would the comparable person for this Cuban surveillance have been Mr. Phillips? For directing all, yes. For directing all the operations against the Cuban embassy, it would have been Dave Phillips at the time. And would it be fair to say that within the Soviet surveillance that you were the principal administrative officer for Mr. Scott? Yes, I think you could use that term. Was there a person who would be a somewhat equivalent administrative officer for Mr. Phillips for Cuban surveillance? You mean did taps of the Cuban embassy? Yes. No. Well, I don't know what Dave Phillips' setup was in that office. There were 4 or 5 people over there, and I'm not familiar with the division of their labor. I didn't know what each one did without checking references and trying to figure out who was taking care of projects. I think I always took the transcripts in and put them on Dave's desk. But Dave had no jurisdiction on that project. He got the product, but that was it. He could ask for a line to be changed, but that was it. Mr. Scott made those decisions, then he gave the instructions to me, and I took them to the other person, or he went directly to the people he was in touch with, and he had them make the changes. But Dave never got involved in that operation except that he got the product from him. So in terms of establishing the operation for Cuba, the principal person making decisions was Mr. Scott. Is that correct? For that phone tap operation, yes. For the phone tap operation. Now, it might have been, I don't know, but there may have been an redacted tap on one of the Cuban lines. So what we're talking about is the one that the project that I ran. Okay. Who else worked under Mr. Phillips on the Cuban project? Now, I can't tell you who would, the people who were there at the time because I don't remember. I visited some names in that draft. I got those things from the records that I did for John Leader, but I don't know if that was correct or not. The thing that hurts me so much about that is they passed it out as something, a summary of something as the correct thing when what it was just what I could pull together. I'm not sure if those people were there at that time, but I just don't remember who was there in the Cuban office. And then they go off the record for a moment, and they come back. Ms. Goodpasture, just a moment ago, you made reference to a document that you had written that I would like to show a copy of it to you now and ask if this document is the one you were referring. Let the record show I'm handing the witness a document that is on its face dated 10 February 1977. Right. Is this document you're referring to, Ms. Goodpasture? Right. I'd also like to state for the record that the document bears a record identification for form number 104, 10050, 1005. Mrs. Goodpasture, do you believe that the document as written here is an accurate reflection of the background of the Mexico City Station support assets? Well, this document, when I prepared it, was a summary to be used to get an accurate description from those people who were in charge of these operations. I listed the operations and what I could get about them, but it may not be accurate because the case officers handling them may find inaccuracies in these. I took these from records in Washington at the time in order to give them something to work with to put together a summary of the operations that were involved at this time in 1963 in September. Would it be fair to say that you understood the document to be a work in progress and that you were attempting to write something that was accurate, but you cannot verify that it's accurate either now or at that time? Right, it was just a summary to work with, a rough draft, in other words. Okay. And I don't believe it doesn't appear to have ever been checked out with other people who were really responsible for those projects at the time. Do you, before you made reference to this specific document, I was asking about people who were involved in the Cuba area under Dave Phillips. I would just like to ask you if the name Bob Shaw prompts any recollection in your mind about whether he was involved with Cuba. Bob Shaw was there. I don't know if he was there in 1963 or not, and I mean in September and November. And the way I remember it was that Bob Shaw was the head of Cuba section, and then Dave Phillips came down and was put in charge. But there again, Bob Shaw would be the person who could tell you. I don't know when his tour, when he left. On what appears to be page 6 of this document that you have been referring to, yeah, I took this from the personnel runs. After I did this, I found that some of the information on these personnel runs were not correct. They were from like dates of assignment and dates of people didn't go when they were assigned, and so I don't know if these dates can be relied upon or not. Okay. You're going to have to check the model. Let me point out to you. For example, Bob Shaw identified as Chief of Cuba Operations with the dates 463 and to 465. And Dave Phillips also marked Chief of Cuba Operations for the dates 863 to 6 of 65. Now, obviously, these two dates overlap. Would that be an example of where you're not certain about who was the Chief of Cuban Operations at the time? Well, I think originally it was Shaw and Phillips came down. It was named over Shaw, but I'm real hazy, foggy about who was there, who was working on Cuban operations at that time. Man, that selective memory is a bitch, isn't it? Could you look also at the covert action section, and I'll draw your attention to the dates 961 to 364, where Dave Phillips appears to be identified as the chief. Does that help refresh your recollection about the comparative roles of Phillips, Shaw, and their projects? It may have been that Dave Phillips came down there as a CA officer, and then he left and came back as head of the Cuban section, but I can't remember. According to this document, which you've also, yes, you've already identified as being not necessarily accurate. It suggests Mr. Phillips began the Cuban activities in 8 of 63, though I also note there's even a question about what the date would be there. Do you have any independent recollection of Mr. Phillips becoming progressively involved in activities related to Cuba in 63? Well, I can't remember when he came, and when I think he came was there for a tour as CA officer. He left and came back, and when he came back as head of the Cuban task force, but I just can't remember. Do you know whether Mr. Phillips reported directly to any person other than to Mr. Scott? Would you ask that again, please? Sure, let me rephrase it. Did Mr. Phillips have as direct supervisor anyone other than Mr. Scott as far as you're aware? Not to my knowledge. So, Mr. Scott wasn't there, of course. The deputy chief of station would be responsible for his supervision. Sure, do you know whether Mr. Phillips had any separate relationship or separate independent reporting responsibilities to anyone at JM Wave during 63? No, there was, I vaguely remember, a staff meeting when Dave was named, as we were all advised that he was the head of the task force, the Cuban task force, but no separate communication channel was discussed, but there were lateral communications between all the stations. Sure. I mean, if the chief of station of Mexico wanted to communicate with the chief of station in Santiago, they could send a pouch through, but it didn't go to one individual, it went through lateral communications. Okay, and a copy of whatever they sent went to Washington, but if you're talking about getting instructions, I don't know. Let me make reference to the Cuban Missile Crisis from October of 1962 to see if that jogs a memory of what kind of role Mr. Phillips would have had in relation with Cuba in 63. I don't remember that. Are you acquainted with an operation called Operation Mongoose? I remember that cryptally, but I don't remember what it was. Operation Mongoose existed certainly during 61 and 62, and consisted of many operations against Cuba, and most of the documents related to that have been declassified now. There arises the question about what the United States did in relationship to Cuba after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and at that time, that Operation Mongoose was officially terminated. I don't remember anything about that. All right, so her fucking firm and definitive, I don't remember anything about this, whereas she's been wishy-washy on every statement so far, tells me she knows a whole goddamn lot about this. A whole lot. Are you familiar with the name Redacted? Yes, Redacted was the outside. He was an FBI officer. He was recruited by Win Scott, inaugurated by most of the people who were in the station, and he was recruited to head up the surveillance operation with using semi-official credentials. He was the other person in the other project that I worked on who handled our surveillance, the Redacted surveillance team. Did he have any responsibilities in addition to working on surveillance that you're aware of? Well, he obtained information on travel. He had a lot of contacts in the Redacted government that were used, and I can't remember all the things that may have been used for. Do you know whether he had any contacts with the Mexican Redacted? I think that's where he got a lot of the credentials for the Able surveillance team. What role, as far as you were aware, did Redacted have in surveillance of either the Soviet or Cuban embassies? I don't know what they... Are you talking about what they did independently or what people did with their credentials for us? What their people with credentials did for the agency? Well, what happened is he got blank credentials and then put in the name. These people were used those for doing pretext investigations or collecting travel information. I don't recall that they were used against the Soviets. And I don't recall that they used to check out leads from the phone tap operation. When they were used in cases like if you came to Mexico and someone came down, Mr. Scott would call me and say, the ambassador's here and so is down here. And he has the FBI has an order to investigate his activities if he's stolen a lot of money and this is his photograph. I want you to check and see if he visited. They think he's on his way to Cuba. Can you find out, look through the files and see if his photograph is there? And also, would you go out and have a surveillance team go and find out check all the motels and see if they can't locate him. And if they find him, have them redacted because they want to redacted. Now we would use them for something like that. You would use Mr. Redacted for something like that? We would use, yes, he would direct the surveillance teams. When you said, from what I recall, that he, Mr. Redacted, would use their credentials, I understood you mean that Mr. Redacted would use redacted credentials. Was that correct? Well, they were credentials that were blank ones, and I think that they were some little office from the redacted, but not necessarily. I think that there was these short redactions, I think, are FBI. He would use FBI credentials, right? And I think they were ones from the office, the FBI, but not necessarily the only credentials that they used. I don't know. I can't answer that truthfully, because the FBI is not really supposed to be doing stuff out of the country, right? We just use the term official credentials, and they may have used them only to flash them. Do you remember the name Richard Cain? Richard who? Cain, C-A-I-N. Cain, Richard Cain, no. How closely did the Mexico City station work with and I believe, again, it's FBI. Well, through periods, there were different stages. And about the Richard Cain thing, Richard Cain was a Chicago mobster. He was a former Chicago cop turned mobster. He ends up getting killed. I can't connect him to the assassination other than statements from his boss, Marshal Caifano. Marshal Caifano had made statements to people that he was in Dealey Plaza, meaning Richard Caifano was in Dealey Plaza, which I don't doubt. Okay, a whole bunch of people were there. Richard Cain worked directly for Marshal Caifano at the time for the mob, right? So I think a lot of the rumor about Richard Cain being a gunman and stuff, and he got killed, I can't find anything connecting him to there other than statements of Marshal Caifano with him admitting that he was in Dealey Plaza. But that doesn't put Richard Cain there, right? Not really. So a lot of people want to, and I think I wanted to at one time, but I just can't do it. There's just no evidence that Richard Cain was involved in any of this stuff. Period. The Chicago mob sent, they sent the guys from Cleveland, and they sent Lenny Patrick and Dave Yaris. That's it. They didn't send Cain. I'll tell you that much. Through periods, there were different stages. In the early days, there was a surveillance team of redacted that we recruited and used, and then that person was arrested for murder or something, and that bunch fell by the board. Later, I believe the redacted, I think FBI, provided some kind of cover for the redacted operation. Mr. Scott, I think, had a personal relationship with the probably chief or deputy chief or something like that. I can't remember his name now, and I think he was the one who provided some of the personnel for us to use. Did you have any personal opinion regarding the quality of the work performed by redacted? In Mexico, you got what you paid for it. We didn't pay them very much. There were different valuations of your product. Some was that the work was very poor, and others thought they were doing an excellent job. The things that they were used the most for, the way I remember doing it, was using pretext and checking out investigations where it didn't matter to us if it appeared that the Mexican government was doing it. If we wanted something that was very secure, we did it ourselves. Did you have any experiences witnessing corruption within the redacted? I think he's talking about the Mexican investigative service. And the answer is only through rumors, but what is corruption to us is not necessarily corruption to them. Their salaries were made. I mean, they made their living on what they got from their extracurricular activities. Did you ever have any reason to believe that redacted would engage in torture of people who were being interrogated by redacted? Well, I had no firsthand knowledge of that, but I mean, I was never in the room and they were interrogating people. Now, I didn't see anybody banged up or bruised. We always heard rumors, but there were newspaper stories about that, just as we hear about it in this country. And then Mr. Gunn says, if we can go off the record for a second. And then they take a lunch recess. And they return from their recess. Continuing on. I would like to ask the reporter to mark this exhibit number 1. This document is exhibit number 1 to the deposition, and I will state for the record that it is a 5-page document that bears a record identification of number 104-10088-1001. And it appears on its face to be a fitness report for Ann L. Goodpasture, dated on the second page, 14th of January, 1964. I'd also like to state for the record that it appears on its face that this is, in fact, a combination of 2 separate documents, the 5th page being a recommendation for honor or merit award that bears no date but references the retiring date of Ann Goodpasture as 23 October 1973. I would also like to record the fact that Ms. Goodpasture is being shown an unredacted version of the document. The exhibit is a redacted version of the document. Ms. Goodpasture, prior to today, do you have any recollection of previously having seen the document that's now marked Exhibit 1 to this deposition? The first part of this document was the part that was prepared at the station, and I would have signed that normally. I think my signature on here is this. When you say your signature is here, you're referring to the second page, right? I note that approximately. And this part was blank. The comments were put in Washington. And when you're saying the comments are blank, you're referring to the bottom of the paragraph too? Yes. That was a Washington desk officer. This document was prepared in Mexico City, and it went down to number 3 on page 2. I would have signed this part, and I like to think that all those nice things he said about me were not exaggerated, although you're referring to the comments on the first page of the document. On the first page. Now the reviewing officer was a Washington desk officer. I have no comment to make on that. There was a professional jealousy between Redacted and Win Scott, and you'll find these comments, similar comments, probably on many of the others. I don't remember how long he was on that desk, but there was a lot of friction there at that time, not just about me. I think it was directed as much toward chief of station as anyone else. Now over on page 5, I think this date is wrong, July. You're referring to page 3 of the document? 72, page 3 of 5, right. So the first, I didn't see this document, his page 3, and I think that date of July is wrong because I think I went on leave in March or something. I had a physical examination, and it was like 2 days later or something. They called and said your last day is tomorrow because you've been given your disability retirement. The reason I was given disability retirement was because of my hearing. It was thought that my hearing was caused by Adderall, which I took when I was on duty in the Far East during World War II. Ms. Goodpasture, I would like to ask you some particular questions about the document if I could. The first question pertains to the specific duty number on the first page. It appears as if you have been identified as having responsibilities for at least 5 different areas as identified on the first page. Could you look over those 5 areas and tell me whether there are any areas you see on that page that you perceive to be inaccurate? Well, I worked with Tom Keenan, and I believe we have thought that I was doing most of the supervision for Tom. Tom was a junior officer, and that I was actually supervising part of it, but I met the people who handled the photo basis only when Tom was away, and that was like only 2 or 3 times. But generally, he did all the meeting. He made all the administrative decisions. He wrote the project reports. He did all the work on the project. I may have made suggestions, but not in a supervisory level, and that was just something that slipped through there. When you're referring to Tom, looking at it from hindsight, when you're referring to Tom, you're referring to Tom Keenan. Is that correct? Right. Mr. Gunn then says, can we go off the record? And they go off the record. Okay, with respect to specific duty number 2, is there anything in there that you can identify as being inaccurate? No, that consisted of handling their request for traces. There were some instances when they had military personnel who were AWOL. We looked for them, but most of this was for to make sure that all their requests for information is funneled, was recorded. And when you say they in your previous answer, you're referring to Army, Navy, Air Force? Army, Navy, and FBI. I assume that the abbreviation CE is included in there. I assume it means counter-espionage. In that case, it would be some cases where military personnel, they might have double agents that were down there that came down for temporary periods, and that would be a CE operation. I would have handled the liaison of those cases. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald was a member of the Marine Corps Reserve at the time he defected to the Soviet Union. When he came to Mexico City later, would the fact that he was a former Marine bring him within the scope of specific duty number 2 for you? Well, what we did in his case, when we got the information on him, we didn't know what he was, so that information was not passed. If there had been an operation that involved him operationally, if he had been coming down there on instructions from the military to make contact with the Soviets, they probably should have coordinated it with us, in which case I would have been the liaison person. When you say originally, you didn't know this was at the time of the original intercept in October. All we got was the phone call. We didn't have a record of him in our card file. So this was before you had been contacted back by headquarters about Oswald. We weren't contacted from headquarters about Oswald. We contacted headquarters. We sent the cable to headquarters that put Oswald's name, and then headquarters came back to the station. When he called the Soviet embassy, to my knowledge, we had no previous record at the station of Oswald. I'd like to show you a document that we'll be marking as an exhibit later. That is a cable from headquarters to Mexico City. The cable number is 74830, dated October 10th, 1963. And again, that will be marked as an exhibit later, where it identifies Oswald as a former radar operator in the U.S. Marines who defected to the USSR in October of 1959. So my question now, would you be would the Oswald case come within your regular area of responsibility as identified in area number 2 if he had been identified as a former Marine? The only part of that case that would have normally come to me would have been handling the liaison with them, but the case itself, if he were contacting the Soviets, the Soviet officer would have had the responsibility for him. But if the Soviet officer was making a dissemination to the military attaché, he would have been given a copy of it to me, and I would have given it to them. In terms of the standard operating procedure, if you received a copy of the October 10th cable, which we've not yet established that you saw, but that if you had received that, would you have any responsibility at that point to notify the Navy of Oswald's visit to the Soviet Union? If it were an incoming message and Washington instructed us to, we would distribute the copy of it to the military attaché. If it were an incoming message that concerned the military and Washington said for station information, that's where it would have stayed. So would it be fair to say at least that based upon the October 10th cable from headquarters to Mexico City that you did not yourself have any responsibility to notify any other entity of the U.S. government in Mexico City? Without instructions, no, I wouldn't take it upon myself to run down and tell them. Okay. Really, the term would be coordinating the liaison. Okay. With respect to specific duty number 3, is that an accurate statement of your responsibilities? I don't know what number 3 is missing here on the side. I'll note for the record that the copy of that page, I don't recall being in contact myself with this guy, Horsfall. The other 2 I was a contact for. Okay, let me just note for the record that the copy of the document Miss Goodpasture is looking at has part of the left-hand margin eliminated, and so she's been looking at the document as marked in the exhibit to help clarify. With respect to duty number 4, do you find that to be accurate? Yes, if somebody wanted a photograph made or something, a copy made, well then the person, if the photographer was gone or sick or whatever, I usually had to do it. Flaps and seals, we didn't have any flaps and seals as of 19. I don't think we had much of that work by 1963. I think we finished most of that before then. Previously in the deposition, we talked about your responsibility for CE matters in Mexico City, or the degree of responsibility that you have. Does the specific duty number 5 prompt any recollection in your mind about any other CE responsibilities that you may have had in Mexico City? I can't remember all the cases that we had just off the top of my head. There were so many short-term things, like the example I mentioned to you. If somebody came down that one of the other government agencies were interested in, and they made contact with the Cuban embassy, they may not have been there very long. I probably would have been, if it was an FBI person of interest to the FBI, I would have been a coordinating officer on that. I remember a case that there was a Chinese intelligence officer that went AWOL from some training program in Texas, and that he came down there and he wanted to go back to the mainland, and that sort of thing only lasted for a short period of time. I mean, a few days. But still, it was that sort of thing I would get sometimes. Did you ever have any responsibility for Lee Harvey Oswald within the scope of the... No. Under assigned specific duty number 5? No. Could you look at... I don't know any of the counter-espionage that involved Oswald. The only thing that I knew about Oswald came from that first, the transcript where his name was mentioned. Are you referring to the October 1st? Right. And then any other correspondence that may have come down that related to that visit, and the person who would have gotten the action copy on that generally would have been the Soviet desk officer. But there were times when questions came up that they might not be there, when Scott would say, write this cable or look up this name, and may have been something in connection with the Oswald investigation, but I don't recall any instances. If there had been a counter-espionage investigation involving Oswald by the Mexico City station in the ordinary course, would you have had some responsibility for that? It's hard to say if he were going to direct it to the Soviet embassy. The action would have been the Soviet desk officer. If he had been directed to go to the Cuban embassy, the action would have been the Cuban desk officer. If he were going to meet somebody from the military attaché's office, then I might have been asked to coordinate. But does that answer your question? Yes, thank you. For specific duty number 6, is the statement included there inaccurate as far as you understand? Number 6, we had a steady stream of people coming from headquarters. Most of them did not want to look at a printed page. But if there were pictures or charts, then they would always be staff meeting, and then those things were used. He did briefings all the time. He being Win Scott. Win Scott. What does the term fireman mean in number 6? You, if you went to Mexico, you would probably be called a visiting fireman. They were headquarters representatives who came down to conduct a survey, to hold interviews, to work on the budget. We had one high-ranking official that came down once for the purpose of getting in the car and riding around to the meeting that I had made early in the morning. And the next day, he was in a car early in the morning with Tom Keenan, and he went back to Washington and recommended we had to have bodyguards. We were carrying so much paper and so much compromising material, and of course, nothing happened from that. Someone else came down. I suppose you should take this off the record because it would make good reading material for some journalist. Do you wish to do that? I think we should probably stay on record. Then I won't proceed any further. Is that what you were about to say, an anecdote about something that happened in Mexico City? Well, I don't think it's pertinent at this time to this efficiency report. Okay, Ms. Goodpasture, could you turn to the third page of the document? 3. There is what appears to be a full paragraph going on to the next page that looks as if it was a recommendation by David Phillips. Is that correct as far as you're aware? Well, now I never saw this. This was mentioned in that book. After reading it and seeing that Cuban embassy, I wanted to say that I was not responsible for the identification of Oswald at the Cuban embassy and his dealings with the Cuban embassy. First, if we can just say, is your understanding that this was written by David Atlee Phillips, although you are not certain of that? Well, I was told, now I don't remember now who told me, but I was told that Redacted prepared this, but he prepared it, I'm sure, at David Phillips' direction, because I think Dave Phillips signed it, didn't he? You mean it appears to me as if that's what happened? Right here. And that would be your understanding as well, although you, of course, don't know for certain. I don't know who wrote it, but I wasn't there then. Okay, I'd like to draw your attention to the second paragraph of the document, where it first makes a reference to the coup in Guatemala in 1954. Is that first sentence accurate to the best of your understanding? Well, mine's chopped off on the side. Well, I worked on the Guatemala project, served in support, and I had a support-type job there. I collected information that was used for drop zones and general office work. I didn't handle any agents while I was down there. So do you find the first sentence to be reasonably accurate? The first sentence in paragraph 2? Yes. Okay. Again, just in terms. It looks like it runs off somewhere. Just in terms of the first sentence, does the first sentence seem reasonably accurate as it relates to Guatemala? I think it is. The second sentence describes you as, quote, a troubleshooting, end quote, case officer for the incomparable Win Scott. Let me try 2 questions. Was Mr. Scott's full first name Winfield? I don't know what he means by troubleshooting. I certainly was in the line of fire as far as things being passed on to get rid of. Was Mr. Scott's first name Winfield? No, Winston. Do you know how an error might have occurred to replace Mr. Scott's first name with Winston Winfield? Maybe Dave Phillips thought his name was Winfield. Okay. You find sometimes that some writers draw out their ideas phonetically and they have someone else that comes along and cleans them up and makes all the corrections, and he may have thought Winfield, Winchester, Winston, something like that. Win is shortened from. Okay, then with respect to troubleshooting case officer, do you think that is an accurate description of what you were doing in 63? In 63, while I was doing a job that not any other case officers wanted to do. In that case, I suppose that some people would interpret it as being a troubleshooter. In the next sentence, it refers to you as being one of the most competent CI/CE officers he ever had the privilege to work with. First, did you consider yourself to be a CI/CE officer? Well, in those days, you had career categories that were labels that you drew boxes and you were put in. Generally, the type of work that you did, and that was the box I happened to fall into. So you think that is more descriptive of a category that has been used to describe you in agency records rather than your job function in Mexico City? Well, how I would describe it and how someone else would describe it might be 2 different things, just in terms of your own description. In terms of my own description, I was labeled a CI/CE officer, and generally within one of their slots, every category had a certain number of slots that they reserved for people who had some experience doing that kind of work. See, instead of just a simple fucking yes, she had to go on to this fucking 2-page goddamn, well, sort of, kind of, maybe not really kind of explanation. Like, I fucking hate these people. Now, we talked about this towards the beginning of the deposition, so I'd like to make just one reminder back to what we said before. Did you have in 1963 any responsibility for reporting on CI/CE matters to the CI staff outside of your responsibilities to Mr. Scott? Well, the counter-espionage operations and the counterintelligence information was reported both to the division. Only those highly sensitive ones, special cases, were under the action of the CI staff. And did you have any responsibilities in 1963 to report things to the CI staff? I don't recall any of the cases that I was reported directly to them at the time. And I assume that would include Oswald, in that you did not have any responsibility for reporting on Oswald to the CI staff. We didn't know that CI staff was the action on Oswald until at the time when the reports went in. They went in routinely. Have you had any reason to believe subsequently that CI staff had any role in respect to Oswald prior to the assassination? I don't know. Could you turn to the following page, which is the fourth page of the document that is continuation of Section D? I would like to turn your attention to the second full sentence, which I will read for the record. She, that is referring to Ms. Goodpasture, was the case officer who was responsible for the identification of Lee Harvey Oswald in his dealings with the Cuban embassy in Mexico. Is that statement correct? No. In what respect is that statement not correct? Lee Harvey Oswald was identified in connection with his dealings with the Soviet embassy. That was where we got the identification of that name. I don't remember anything about his dealings with the Cuban embassy except office gossip. I thought I was under the impression that perhaps wrongly the transcript which showed him at the Cuban embassy was connected with his name as a result of Sylvia Duran's arrest, but you mentioned that it was set up a few weeks after he was there, so I was wrong on that, but I was not. I didn't read the transcripts unless I brought them in. Somebody else was the one who identified him as being at the Cuban embassy, and I don't remember who it was, but that statement is not correct. Really? Like, what did I say before, people? The documents of yesterday are always correct when compared to the fucking lying statements of these CIA fucks when being cross-examined under deposition. It's truly unfucking believable. Could you read the following, or I will read the following sentence for the record, and I would just like your comment on the accuracy of it. She was also responsible for other important and successful operations against Soviet penetration efforts directed towards the United States from Mexico. I don't know what he's talking about there. There were several operations connected directly with the Soviets that I worked on, but I don't know what he meant by that sentence. He may have been referring to the phone tap. I had originally planned to talk to someone about some of the standard operating procedures at the station, but I think we'll go to the transcripts that you've been referring to and try to get this part of the record. Okay. All right, and here he goes on and rambles about marking some documents. So we'll go ahead and we will call it here for today, and we should be able to knock this out in tomorrow's show. So thanks for tuning in, everybody. I'll be back tomorrow.